And welcome everyone to Sports Talk Line, where we talk sports 24/7, 365. Now, in today's episode of Battle for the Big East, we'll be talking UConn basketball with Jared Kotler. Jared, how you doing today?
Hey, Tom, doing well. Thanks so much for having me on. Always fun to talk some Big East hoops with you.
Yes, thanks for coming on, Jared, in this very unique time as we're all socially distanced and wondering when the next shoe is going to drop. But I think the Big East made an interesting decision this week, or recently, I should say. They had the rule coming in that if you have COVID outbreak on the team, you have to forfeit. The Big East pivoted on that decision and said, you know what, it's not going to be a forfeit. You're going to reschedule or try to reschedule the games. How do you feel about the Big East decision in making that move?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think when you look back at when they put the rule in place, it was in a time where vaccinated people weren't necessarily getting COVID at the same rate they are right now with this new variant. So, I think it was initially kind of put in place to punish those teams that might not have been as vaccinated and to really make it a point that, hey, if you're vaccinated, you're probably not going to end up having to cancel games. And if you do, then you're going to get punished with the forfeit. But given how circumstances have changed, I think it makes sense. And you never know what the schedules are going to be like, where holes might be. So I think it makes sense to try to fit in these games wherever possible. I know it might make for some funky standings at the end, but so did giving teams wins or losses based on having to, forfeit games. It was a little weird seeing, what was it? DePaul, who had a great non-conference and looked like they were doing well, was going to be 0-2 to start the Big East without having played a game. So I think it makes sense to try to push this and see what they can work out.
Yeah, I also think too, because you're trying to get as many teams into the NCAA tournament as possible.
Yeah, and these games matter.
A forfeit doesn't help anyone really get in. The loss doesn't mean anything. So it's that I think everyone's in agreement that the Big East did make the right choice with the way things are going in the last week and a half to 10 days. Mm-hmm. But getting back to UConn, which you're a big follower of, how do you rate UConn's out of conference performance?
Yeah, I think they had a pretty solid non-conference. I know the big challenge for them was heading down to a pretty loaded battle for Atlantis in the Bahamas there. And they came away with two decent wins. Auburn, who I think is number 12 right now. So that win's going to really boost their resume throughout the year. They really battled Michigan State, lost a close one there. There was a tough foul that was called at the end of the game, which fans are still a little bit bitter about. It might have cost them some things in that game against Michigan State, but I think they lost by, it was either 4 or 6, somewhere around that line there. And then they beat a pretty decent VCU team. So I think those are, two good wins that they got out of the trip to the Bahamas. They had the Big East Big 12 game against West Virginia, which they were shorthanded for, missing 2 of their better players in Tyrese Martin and Adama Sanogo. And they lost that game by a basket. I think they shot 3 of 23 it was from 3 in that game. So when you look at that, even shorthanded, make one more 3 and it's a whole different game there. And you're looking at things like, hey, this team shorthanded went into West Virginia and was able to beat them. So I think that one was interesting. And then, that same week they played a game against St. Bonaventure and they were able to win that one on a neutral court. So I think, looking at things, 3 pretty good wins for them in the non-conference. They didn't really play much of anyone else in terms of the home slate. It was pretty much cupcake after cupcake, 300 plus Ken Palm teams, which I didn't love. I wanted to see a little bit more step up in the competition there. But at the end of the day, pretty solid non-conference schedule for them. And now it's time for the real battle in the Big East.
Yeah, now you kind of mentioned it before too. UConn was without some of their star players. And the main one the main returner who a lot of people were talking about was Adama Sanogo. And he missed some times with, I believe, an abdominal injury. How do you think that injury has impacted UConn basketball?
Yeah, it was tough because going into the season, Dan Hurley had mentioned multiple times how he really designed the offense to flow through Adama Sanogo. And you saw that early on in that game against Auburn. They won. He had 30 points and 6 rebounds in that game. Against Michigan State, he had 18 and 10. So, I mean, he's a big focal point for this UConn, both offensively and defensively. So to lose him was tough. But the other guy they missed was Tyrese Martin. He's a guy who really stuffs the stat sheet and can do a little bit of everything. He's a really athletic guard. He could shoot a bit, really good at driving down to the basket, plays great defense. So not having both of those guys was really tough for them. But Sanogo was just back in their second Big East game against Marquette. I think he got about 12 minutes. looked a little bit rusty, but again, to be expected when you've missed 3 weeks with an ab strain and haven't been able to do a ton of basketball work. So I'm interested to see what he looks like as they head down the next couple of games. But getting those guys back and getting healthy, I think, is big for this team. I think Dan Hurley said it best after the Marquette game when they won. You know, at full strength, they're undefeated. So it shows you what this team could do, when they're healthy.
Yes, and if you want to be undefeated, hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube so you get all this great Battle for the Big East content along with all our other highlight videos. Now, we kind of mentioned with Adama Sanogo, he was the big presence, 6'9", 240, tremendous athlete inside. But there's been a little, how we got to talk about the freshmen coming in now, because UConn was not hit hard at all by the transfer portal, unlike a lot of other teams. They really didn't have any all conference players come back with the fifth year, like a Paul Scruggs or a Nate Watson. But how do you think the freshmen have developed for UConn so far this season?
So the freshmen really haven't developed a ton. They haven't gotten a ton of playing time. They did return some fifth-year guys in Isaiah Whaley, who was, the co-defensive player of the year last year in the Big East, and Tyler Polley, who was the sixth man of the year. So they've taken up some of those minutes there. Jordan Hawkins is a really good athletic shooter. He injured himself before the season started, so I had to miss 3 games. So he was slowly working his way back into it. He's got a really sweet looking stroke from three. Gone through some ups and downs, as any freshman really does during their early part of their careers. So I'm excited to see what he can give them a little bit more. And I think heading into the season, he was going to compete to try to be a starter for these guys. So he's starting to get some more minutes, especially as guys were out. He got to take on a little bit of a bigger role. So more to come from him. But the other 2 freshmen they had in Rasul Diggins and Samson Johnson, quite honestly, really haven't gotten a ton of playing time. I know fans are calling for some more, especially for Rasul Diggins. Get another ball handler out there and see what he could do. But clearly, if Dan Hurley's not playing him, he's seeing something in practice or something that's not living up to what he wants to see out of him on the court there to make a big difference. So more to come on the freshmen. I mean, it was a pretty good recruiting class. I think both Diggins and Johnson were top 50 players, along with Hawkins. So pretty good recruiting class. But again, they've got some depth in terms of the returners who are back and guys in front of them. When you're looking at a Rasul Diggins, who's a point guard, you've got RJ Cole, you've got Jalen Gaffney ahead of him, Samson Johnson, who's a big guy, you've got Isaiah Whaley, a Cook, Adama Sanogo, all in front of him. So it's been tough to get them some minutes. We'll see how they develop throughout the rest of the season, but not sure how much you'll see from them throughout the rest of the season here.
Yeah, and I also think a big challenge for freshmen coming in this year for college basketball is the freshmen last year, they're supposed to be sophomores, but eligibility-wise, they still got the same amount of eligibility. So that's going to be a reoccurring story for the next several years, to say the least, with the extra exemption, with the transfers and who's going to stay and go and all that.
Definitely.
But going back to, we kind of talked about the freshmen. Now we're going to talk about the whole UConn team. What do you think are some of the strengths of Dan Hurley's team so far?
I think one thing that Dan Hurley really prides himself on is having a really good defensive team. And this team has been very good defensively. They're going to really bother you. And I think they've done a good job at that with mixing and matching pieces, especially down low. They've got great shot blockers. Isaiah Whaley, Sanogo can block some shots. Cook has started to step up a little bit more. And he's a guy who's shown in the past couple games that he could stretch it out a little bit. So he could be that really disruptive shot blocker. But he could also go out and shoot threes now. So if he could become a little bit more of a consistent player there, that's a big piece. Their post play again has been really strong, especially when Adama Sanogo has been out there. So I think those have probably been their biggest strengths. Throw in, RJ Cole's a great scoring guard. So what he's been able to do has been impressive so far this season. He's going to take on a little bit, more of some extra load when those guys went down. But again, I think against Marquette, him and Tyrese Martin, I think, had 40 or so of the 78 points against Marquette. So those 2 senior guys really stepping it up and giving them some presence there. I know the big issue, or the big question rather, on UConn heading into the season was who's going to make up James Bouknight's scoring and who's going to be able to make up for that. And I thought the thing I liked about this team was they had depth that didn't have to be one guy who had to step up and take on that role. And I think you're seeing and you've seen throughout the season so far, they've got a number of different guys who can step up and score on any given night.
Yeah, and we talked about that, and you mentioned the scoring load. You mentioned James Bouknight leaving for the NBA for greener pastures, and it kind of was like the magic number for UConn last year was like 70.
Yeah.
It kind of felt like that too. But they did return a lot of players, but they lost their leading scorer, so it's interesting to see how that's going to develop. But we talked about the strengths for the Huskies. What would be some of the weaknesses for UConn this year?
Yeah, you talk about that magic scoring number, and the offense has been a little tough to come by at times. If you look at their game against Providence in the Big East opener, the final was 57-53. UConn really struggled at times, and credit to Providence, who's a great defensive team. But at the same time, UConn missed a bunch of wide open threes. Same thing that happened down in Morgantown against West Virginia when they went 3 of 23. So the offense can get a little bit stagnant at times, and they've struggled to shoot the ball from three, especially Tyler Polley again, who was the sixth man of the year, was really counted on to come back and be that sniper for them. And I think he's shooting 30% on the season so far from three. He's had some cold nights shooting wise, which has been tough for them. And it's something that they need to be able to get right a little bit heading into the rest of Big East play. And I know that's where they were counting on a guy like Jordan Hawkins as a freshman to come in and be able to hit some threes, which he's done at times for them. He did it against Auburn. He hit a couple big ones against St. Bonaventure. So it's going to be some mixing and matching, again, riding the hot hand with possible. But the offensive side of the ball has definitely been a weakness in some regards for UConn this season.
Yeah, now we kind of talked to strengths and weakness. Now going back to the Big East, I mean, the UConn Providence game, it looked like you could have gone to 1988.
Yeah.
I guess, to say the least, with maybe Billy Donovan running the point and maybe Cliff Robinson for the Huskies going out there, because it was a low down, big physical game. I think Providence is the surprise so far.
Definitely.
I think they underachieved last year and they're making up for it this year. But what do you see? What team do you see being the biggest challenge for UConn coming up this Big East season?
I think I'll give you two. I think for every team until they've been knocked down, Villanova is always going to be that team. I know they haven't looked quite, like vintage Villanova, but they're still going to be there. I do like the way UConn matches up with them this year, having some bigger post guys, which is something that they lack a little bit this year. But again, Villanova can shoot lights out and beat you that way too. So they're always going to be a tough matchup. I think one for me that's I don't want to say scares me, but one that I think is going to be tough for UConn is Seton Hall. I think that's a really tough matchup for them. Another team that's athletic. They've got some big guys. I think those are just going to be all-out wars too. Especially when you got Dan Hurley going up against his former school there. Got some Jersey kids on the team in Sonogo and RJ Cole. Those games are going to be battles, and I feel like those are going to be take what you saw against Providence and knock it up a couple notches. And that's what you're going to get, against UConn, Seton Hall. So those are probably the two teams that come to mind. I'm really curious that they go play at Xavier next week. So I'm going to be curious to see what that game looks like. Xavier is one of those teams, too, that was picked preseason right around that same range as UConn, where those teams were expected to compete kind of as, the 2 and 3 outside of Villanova there. So curious to see what that'll look like. But Nova and Seton Hall are the two that come to mind for me right away.
Yeah, it's just with Villanova, like you see them go out there and they might not overwhelm you. They have to play perfect to beat you, but so many times they play pretty close to perfect. Creighton gave them a beating, but Xavier shot lights out in the first half, and then Villanova, I guess, found the switch they've been looking for. So we'll see if that carries on going forward.
Yeah, I think Villanova's interesting. I mean, I was looking at them in their resume the other day, and it's like I can't remember the last time Villanova's lost multiple games in a season by 20 points, and they've already done that twice this year, which is just not something you expect to ever see out of a Villanova team. So maybe there's a step back, and I know those were against good teams too, and Baylor not 100% sold on Creighton yet, but going to play at Creighton's tough. But I don't expect Villanova to lose by 20 there.
Maybe it was the suits. Jared needs to go back to the suits. Maybe the track suits aren't working for it. But Jared, before we go, tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, take a look. Got a ton of UConn content and Connecticut college basketball content too throughout the year. At the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast, you could check us out on all the podcast players on YouTube, at CT Scoreboard Pod on Twitter and Facebook as well. So yeah, check it out. We've got some great content previewing pretty much every game, for UConn in the Big East with a beat writer from opposing teams. Trying to get some cool content too. We just had James Bouknight on last week, so cool to hear from him and what his experience in the Big East was like, and now in the NBA. It's a lot of great content, so check it out. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for coming on, Jared. And remember, listen like you play with intensity.